During renovations of Savannah's old courthouse in 1978, a locked cabinet was uncovered beneath the floorboards, long neglected and swollen from decades of moisture. Inside, County Clerk Martha Hayes discovered a collection of plantation records wrapped in wax-sealed leather bindings, are remarkably intact despite years of heat and humidity. At first glance, the documents appeared ordinary: ledgers of cotton production, land exchanges, and ownership tallies. But threaded through the pages was something far more unsettling. Several entries, written in red ink and dated between 1831 and 1834, documented the same inexplicable occurrence. They described enslaved children born in America who spoke fluent English alongside what officials identified as an unfamiliar African language, one no one could trace or name. They'd never been to Africa. They'd never been taught. The most disturbing detail wasn't in the plantation ledgers themselves. It was in the medical examiner's reports attached to them documenting examinations performed on 7 children between the ages of 4 and 9. Each child demonstrated the ability to speak, read, and even write in 2 completely different languages. Each child exhibited identical behavioral patterns, refusing to speak English in certain locations, showing extreme distress when separated from the others, and according to one doctor's note, displaying knowledge of events and places they could not possibly have witnessed. The records named 14 children in total. 7 were examined. 7 disappeared before they could be. Georgia officials documented everything. Then they locked the files away and never spoke of them again. But somebody knew something. Somebody always knows something. If you're intrigued by stories that challenge everything we think we know about history, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened in coastal Georgia nearly 2 centuries ago raises questions that historians still can't answer. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the deeper we go into this case, the stranger it becomes. Sarah Pierce arrived in Savannah in March of 1831 with her husband Edmund, a physician from Massachusetts, who'd accepted a position as county health inspector. The move represented opportunity. Edmund had been promised a generous salary and a home near the waterfront, far from the overcrowded tenements of Boston, where his medical practice had barely sustained them. Sarah kept detailed journals, a habit she'd maintained since girlhood, filling leather-bound books with observations about their new life in the South. Her early entries paint Savannah as a city of contradictions. The tree-lined streets and elegant townhouses gave way abruptly to sprawling plantations where hundreds of enslaved people worked under conditions Sarah found difficult to witness. She wrote often about the markets where families were separated and sold, where children stood on auction blocks while buyers examined them like livestock. "It troubles my sleep," she wrote in April of that year. "Edmund tells me I must accustom myself to the customs here, but some customs should not be endured. I see mothers weeping in the streets, their children carried away in wagons. I see men in chains, their faces blank with the grief too deep for expression. How does one accustom oneself to such suffering?" The Pierces rented a modest house on East Broad Street, close to the city center. The building was narrow but comfortable, with tall windows that caught the river breeze and a small garden where Sarah attempted to grow herbs and vegetables. Edmund's work required frequent visits to the surrounding plantations. County health inspectors were responsible for documenting disease outbreaks, examining quarantine cases, and certifying the fitness of enslaved people for heavy labor. It was a role that troubled him, Sarah noted, though he never refused the assignments. The salary, after all, was substantial, and they had debts from Edmund's failed Boston practice that needed settling. In those first months, life in Savannah seemed manageable, even pleasant at times. The city hummed with commerce. Ships arrived daily from Europe and the Caribbean, bringing goods and immigrants. The social scene was active. Dinner parties, theater performances, church socials. The Pierces were welcomed as educated Northerners, though Sarah sensed a certain weariness from their Southern neighbors, particularly when conversations turned to politics or labor systems. The Pierce household employed 2 enslaved women, Martha and Bess, both in their 20s, both born on plantations north of the city. The arrangement had been made by their landlord before they arrived. Martha as cook and housekeeper, Bess as laundry and general labor. Sarah wrote about them with a mixture of sympathy and unease, clearly grappling with her role as a beneficiary of an institution she found morally repugnant. Martha sang while she worked this morning. One entry reads, "A song in a language I did not recognize. When I asked her about it, she fell silent and would not meet my eyes. I pressed her gently, explaining I meant no offense, only curiosity. She finally told me it was something her grandmother used to sing. Words passed down, but meanings lost. We keep the sounds," she said, "even when we don't know what they mean anymore." The sadness in her voice haunted me all day. Edmund's work brought him into regular contact with the plantation system's brutality. His medical reports from those early months, preserved alongside Sarah's journals in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, document diseases caused by malnutrition, injuries from overwork, infections from inadequate living conditions. He treated children with rickets, adults with untreated broken bones that had healed incorrectly, countless cases of dysentery and fever. His notes are clinical, professional, but Sarah's journals reveal his private struggles. "Edmund came home silent again tonight," she wrote in May. "When I asked about his day, he merely shook his head." Later, after several glasses of whiskey, he told me about a boy of 7 whose arm had been crushed in mill machinery. The arm was infected, needed amputation, but the owner refused to authorize it, claiming the expense wasn't warranted for a child who hadn't yet proven his value. Edmund performed the surgery anyway without payment. The boy died 3 days later from fever. The coastal region surrounding Savannah had particular characteristics that set it apart from inland Georgia. The Sea Islands, barrier islands stretching along the coast, had been cultivated for rice and cotton since the early 1700s. The labor was brutal, the climate unforgiving. Malaria and yellow fever killed thousands. Many plantations operated on a task system rather than constant oversight, allowing enslaved people to maintain certain cultural practices that might have been suppressed elsewhere. This created pockets of preserved tradition, languages, and customs that originated in West Africa, particularly from regions that are now Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Angola. But what Sarah Pierce would soon encounter had nothing to do with cultural preservation or oral tradition. What she would document in her journals defied every rational explanation that Edmund or anyone else could provide. The city itself had been built on profits from the slave trade. By 1831, Savannah's port ranked among the busiest in the South for cotton exports, and the wealth that trade generated was visible everywhere. In the grand homes along the squares, in the new gas lamps being installed on major streets, in the marble facades of banks and trading houses. But that wealth came at a cost Sarah found increasingly difficult to ignore. "We live in houses built with money earned from human misery," she wrote. "We eat food prepared by hands that are not free. We walk streets cleaned by people who have no choice but to clean them. How long can a society sustain itself on such foundations? How long before the weight of it collapses everything?" She couldn't have known that her question would be answered 3 decades later with a civil war. But her words suggest she sensed something unstable beneath the surface prosperity, some fundamental injustice that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Edmund's position gave him access to levels of plantation operations most outsiders never saw. He witnessed the full scope of the system from the auction blocks where families were separated to the breeding farms where women were forced to produce children who would be sold to the punishment yards where disobedience was met with violence. His medical training made him valuable to plantation owners, but it also made him complicit in a system he privately opposed. Sarah recorded his internal conflict. He says he helps more by working within the system than he could by refusing to participate. He says his medical care saves lives, alleviates suffering, but I see the cost this takes on his soul. He drinks more than he did in Boston. He sleeps poorly. He flinches at loud sounds. The social fabric of Savannah in 1831 was complex and stratified. At the top were the plantation owners and wealthy merchants, families who'd been in Georgia for generations and controlled most of the land and capital. Below them were professional men like Edmund, doctors, lawyers, teachers who served the planter class and depended on their patronage. Then came small farmers, artisans, shopkeepers. Free black people occupied a precarious position, legally free, but subject to numerous restrictions and constant surveillance. And at the bottom were the enslaved, who outnumbered whites in many coastal counties, but had no legal rights, no protections, no recourse against abuse. Sarah's journals document this hierarchy with an outsider's eye. She attended church socials where women discussed their household slaves like furniture. She witnessed street confrontations where free black people were detained and questioned by patrols. She saw children, both black and white, playing together until around age 7, when the social order asserted itself, and the casual intimacy of childhood gave way to rigid separation. It was into this world that the strange phenomenon would emerge, challenging assumptions and creating panic among people who thought they understood the system they'd built. The first incident occurred on June 12, 1831, a Thursday morning already hot and humid by the time Edmund received the summons. A rider from Bellbrook Plantation arrived at the Pierce home just after dawn, his horse left from hard travel. The overseer, Walter Grimm, had sent an urgent message. 3 children in the slave quarters had fallen ill with symptoms that concerned him: high fever, confusion, and what he described as speaking in tongues. Edmund prepared his medical bag while Sarah insisted on accompanying him. She'd been pestering him for weeks to see the plantations he visited, wanting to document the living conditions she'd only heard about second-hand. Edmund initially resisted, citing the impropriety of a woman observing such conditions. But Sarah had persisted. "If you can witness it, so can I," she'd argued. "And if we're both witness, perhaps we can both testify to the truth of what happens in these places." They rode out in a hired carriage, the journey taking nearly 3 hours on muddy roads still soft from recent trains. The landscape changed gradually as they left Savannah. The developed city giving way to cultivated fields, then to wilder terrain where massive oaks created tunnels of shade over the road. Spanish moss hung from every branch, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that Sarah found both beautiful and unsettling. They passed several smaller plantations, seeing enslaved people working in the fields before Bellbrook appeared as they crested a small rise. The plantation was larger than Sarah had imagined. A main house of whitewashed brick stood on a gentle hill 3 stories tall with wide verandas wrapping around each level. Behind it stretched fields in every direction, cotton mostly, but also corn and some rice in the lower wetter areas, and everywhere people working under a sun that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Sarah counted over 50 people visible from the road alone. Edmund later told her Bellbrook held nearly 200 enslaved people, making it one of the larger operations in the county. The slave quarters were arranged in 2 rows behind the main house. Small wooden structures with mud-chinked walls and roofs of cypress shingles. Vegetable gardens grew between the buildings. Small patches where families could supplement the meager rations provided by the plantation. Children too young for field work played in the dirt roads between the buildings. Their laughter carrying on the humid air. The contrast between their innocent play and the grim realities of their situation struck Sarah forcefully. Walter Grimm met them at the main house. A hulking man with sunburnt skin and hands like slabs of meat. He was in his 40s, Sarah guessed, with the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. He seemed agitated, speaking rapidly as he led Edmund toward the quarters. Sarah followed despite Grimm's obvious disapproval. "The children are in the sick house," Grimm explained. "Been there since yesterday morning, won't eat proper, won't respond when we speak to them. Just keep talking in some, I don't know what it is, African maybe, but none of the others recognize it. And the strange part is," he paused, glancing back at Sarah as if uncertain whether to continue in her presence. "Go on," Edmund prompted. "They weren't doing this yesterday morning," Grimm said. "They were normal at breakfast, working their tasks. Then, right around midday, all 3 of them just stopped moving, stopped responding, started speaking this language. Their own mothers don't know what they're saying. The sick house was a separate structure, isolated from the main quarters to prevent the spread of disease. It was smaller than the family cabins, with a single room and no windows, just gaps in the walls for ventilation. Inside, 3 children sat on rough wooden benches. 2 girls, 1 boy, ages appearing to range from 5 to 8. They weren't crying or showing signs of physical distress. They sat perfectly still, hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead at the opposite wall. And they were speaking a continuous rhythmic stream of words in a language Sarah had never heard. The sound of it raised the hairs on the back of her neck. It wasn't random babbling or the fevered nonsense of illness. It had structure, rhythm, melody almost. The words flowed in patterns, repeating certain phrases, building on each other like a conversation or a story being told. But all 3 children spoke in perfect unison, their voices blending together so seamlessly that it was impossible to distinguish individual speakers. Edmund approached slowly, introducing himself in a calm, professional voice. The children didn't acknowledge him. Their eyes remained fixed on the wall. Their mouths continued forming words in that strange, haunting language. Edmund knelt beside the nearest girl, a child who looked about 6 years old, with her hair braided in neat rows. He checked her pulse. Normal. He looked into her eyes, pupils responsive to light. He tested her reflexes, all normal. She was physically healthy, showing no signs of fever or illness, despite Grimm's initial report. Sarah recorded Edmund's findings in the small notebook she'd brought. No elevated temperature, no signs of physical illness, pupils responsive, heartbeats normal and steady, breathing unlabored, yet they appear entirely unreachable, as if their consciousness has been transported elsewhere. Edmund tried various approaches to break through to the children. He asked simple questions about their names, their families, how they felt. He offered them water and food. He tried speaking louder, then softer. Nothing produced any response. The children continued their unified speech, never pausing, never looking away from the wall. Then Edmund tried something different. He stood directly in front of the oldest girl, blocking her view of the wall, and said firmly, "Can you hear me? If you understand English, please respond." For the first time, the unified speech faltered. The other 2 children continued, but the older girl fell silent for perhaps 3 seconds. Then, without breaking her forward stare, without any change in her blank expression, she spoke in perfect unaccented English. "We hear you. We understand you. We are here." Edmund felt his heart rate accelerate. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Rebecca." The voice was flat, emotionless, as if the answer required no thought. "Rebecca, what are you saying? What language are you speaking?" "The language of remembering." "Who taught you this language?" "No one taught us. We already knew." "That's not possible, Rebecca. All language must be learned." "Who taught you?" The girl's eyes finally moved, shifting to look directly at Edmund. The blankness in her expression gave way to something else. Not emotion exactly, but awareness, as if someone behind her eyes had suddenly woken up. "We've always known," she said, "since before we were born. Since before our mothers were born. We carry it inside. We are vessels for what came before." Then she returned to speaking in the unknown language, rejoining the other 2 children in perfect synchronization. Edmund tried to prompt more responses, but Rebecca didn't speak English again. The 3 children continued their unified chant, seemingly unaware of his presence. Sarah approached the children carefully, sitting on the bench beside the younger girl. She didn't ask questions, just sat quietly listening to the rhythm of their speech. After several minutes, she began to notice patterns in the unknown language, certain phrases that repeated, certain sounds that seemed to carry emphasis. She tried to transcribe phonetically what she heard, but the sounds were difficult to capture with English letters. "Abakoi," she wrote. "Manda Koshhenda." Edmund spent 2 hours in the sick house attempting various examinations and interventions. He checked the children's physical responses repeatedly. He tried separating them, moving one to a different corner of the room, but this caused immediate distress. The child began trembling and making a high keening sound until returned to the group. He tried offering different foods and drinks to see if specific substances affected their state. Nothing worked. The children remained locked in their trance, speaking their mysterious language. Finally, as the afternoon heat became oppressive in the small, poorly ventilated building, Edmund admitted defeat and suggested they return to Savannah to consult his medical texts. Grimm pulled him aside as they were leaving. Sarah couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she caught fragments. "Not the first time this happened." "What do you mean not the first?" "3 more last week. Different plantation owners keeping it quiet." "Why wasn't I notified?" "He don't want word spreading. Bad for business. People hear your slaves are speaking in tongues. They think witchcraft, possession, all manner of superstitious nonsense." "This isn't superstition, Mr. Grimm. This is a medical phenomenon that requires investigation." "Maybe so, but the owner, Mr. Porter, he wants them sold before the problem spreads. Already got a buyer lined up from Alabama, leaving next week." "You can't sell sick children." "They ain't sick, doctor. That's the problem. They're healthy as horses. They just won't stop with that speaking. Makes the other slaves nervous. Makes everybody nervous." On the ride back to Savannah, Edmund was uncharacteristically silent. Sarah pressed him for his thoughts, but he seemed genuinely baffled. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple by the time he finally spoke. The girl spoke English like she'd been educated. He said perfect grammar, sophisticated vocabulary. She said vessels and remembering abstract concepts. But according to Grimm, none of those children have received any instruction. They work in the fields from age 5. They've never been inside the main house. They've certainly never been taught to read or write. "What was the other language?" Sarah asked. Edmund shook his head. "I don't know." It sounded structured, not random babbling. It had consistent phonemes, grammatical patterns, but I've never heard anything like it. And I've heard most of the African languages that survived here. This was different. Could it be something they created? Children sometimes develop private languages. That crossed my mind. But private languages are usually simplified, childish. This sounded complex, sophisticated, and they spoke in perfect unison. Sarah, that level of coordination suggests either intensive practice or he trailed off or what, or something I don't have a rational explanation for. That night, Sarah wrote in her journal, Edmund believes it is some form of hysteria or shared delusion, perhaps triggered by the trauma of their circumstances. But I heard those children speak. I watched their faces. Whatever they were saying, they understood it completely. They believed it. And the look in Rebecca's eyes when she spoke to Edmund, that wasn't delusion. That was clarity. As if for a moment she was more present, more aware than any of us in that room. She spoke of remembering, of carrying something inside, of being vessels. What did she mean? What were they vessels for? Sarah continued writing late into the night, trying to capture every detail while it was fresh in her memory. She described the rhythm of the unknown language, the synchronized movement of the children's mouths, the blankness in their expressions contrasted with the sudden sharp awareness in Rebecca's eyes when she switched to English. I cannot shake the feeling. Sarah wrote that we witnessed something significant today. Not illness, not madness, something else. Something that challenges our understanding of how knowledge is acquired and transmitted. Edmund will look for medical explanations as is his nature and training, but I fear the answer lies outside the realm of medicine. In what realm, I cannot say. The following day, Edmund spent hours in his study reviewing medical texts on nervous disorders, hysteria, and group delusions. He found case studies of religious ecstasy and mass hysteria in revival meetings, instances of shared hallucinations during fever epidemics, examples of children developing unusual speech patterns due to isolation or abuse. But none of these cases matched what he'd observed. The children at Bellbrook weren't fevered or agitated. They showed no signs of physical trauma, and their language, whatever it was too sophisticated, too structured to be dismissed as nonsense. Sarah, meanwhile, became consumed with the mystery. She began asking Martha and Bess about languages they'd heard on plantations, about stories passed down through generations, about any instances they'd heard of children speaking in unknown tongues. Martha was reluctant to discuss it at first, but eventually, after Sarah assured her the conversation would remain private, she revealed that such things weren't entirely unheard of. "My grandmother told me stories," Martha said quietly, glancing toward the door as if afraid of being overheard, "about children who remembered things they shouldn't know, about old languages that survived even when no one spoke them anymore. She said the ancestors don't forget even when we do. She said sometimes they speak through those who listen." "Do you believe that?" Sarah asked. Martha hesitated. "I believe there are things white folks don't understand about us, things we keep to ourselves, things that survived the crossing even when they tried to take everything else from us." "What things survived?" "Memory," Martha said simply. "You can take away our names, our families, our freedom, but you can't take away what we remember, and what we remember, we pass down. Sometimes in stories, sometimes in songs, and sometimes—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Sometimes in ways that don't make sense to you, but make perfect sense to us." This conversation haunted Sarah. She wrote about it extensively, trying to understand what Martha was suggesting. "She speaks of memory as if it's something tangible, something that can be preserved and transmitted across generations," Sarah wrote. "But memory is individual, isn't it? We remember our own experiences, not the experiences of our ancestors. And yet, what if there are forms of remembering we don't understand? What if trauma, particularly trauma experienced collectively by many people, creates some kind of imprint, some kind of knowledge that persists even when those who experienced it firsthand are gone?" Edmund dismissed this line of thinking as unscientific. "Memory is a function of the brain," he insisted. "It's biological, chemical. It can't be inherited or transmitted except through direct teaching and learning. What you're describing would require some kind of spiritual or supernatural mechanism, and such things don't exist." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She'd seen Rebecca's eyes. She'd heard the language those children spoke, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond ordinary medical science was at work. Over the following weeks, Edmund received similar calls from other plantations in the region. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. Enslaved children ranging in age from 4 to 9, entering trance-like states and speaking in 2 languages, English and the same unknown tongue Edmund had heard at Bell Brook. The children were always born on American soil, always from different families, always showing the same behavioral characteristics. The second incident occurred on June 19 at Riverside Plantation, 12 miles west of Savannah. 2 children this time, both boys, ages 7 and 8. They'd been working in the vegetable garden when they suddenly stopped, sat down in the dirt, and began speaking the language. The overseer had tried shaking them, shouting at them, even threatening them with punishment, but nothing broke through. They sat in the garden for 6 hours before their mother finally convinced the overseer to send for Edmund. By the time Edmund arrived, the boys had been moved to a storage shed. They sat side by side on the dirt floor, still speaking in perfect synchronization. Edmund performed his examinations and found the same results as before. No physical illness, no fever, no signs of trauma. When he tried asking questions in English, the older boy responded, but the response was chilling. "We see what happened here," the boy said, his voice flat and distant. "We see the ones who came before us. We see what was done to them. We remember." "Remember what?" Edmund asked. "Everything. The ships, the markets, the beatings, the ones who died, the ones who lived but wished they hadn't. We carry their memories. We speak their words." "That's impossible. You're too young to remember such things." "You weren't alive when we've always been alive," the boy interrupted. "We died and came back. We came back so someone would remember, so someone would speak." Then he returned to the unknown language, leaving Edmund shaken and confused. The third incident occurred on June 24 at Thornton Fields, a cotton plantation southeast of Savannah. 4 children this time, ages ranging from 4 to 8. The overseer's report mentioned that the children had been found standing in the cotton field at dawn arranged in a circle, all speaking the same words simultaneously. They'd been standing there for an unknown period, possibly all night, though no one could confirm when they left their cabin. Edmund brought Sarah with him this time. Recognizing that her approach with the children yielded different information than his clinical examinations, they found the 4 children sitting in the plantation's chapel, a small wooden structure where enslaved people were required to attend Sunday services. The children sat in the front pew, their hands folded, speaking their unified language. But this time, something was different. Every few minutes, the unified speech would pause and one child would speak a few sentences in English before the group resumed their chanting. Sarah sat in the pew behind them and listened. The English sentences were fragments, disconnected but haunting. "We walked for days and the sun burned our skin. They put chains around our necks. The water was too salty to drink. My mother's name was lost." Each fragment seemed to describe a different experience, a different memory, and each was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone, as if the children were reading from some vast, terrible book of accumulated suffering. Edmund attempted to document the phenomenon scientifically, recording the timing of the episodes, the duration of the transenses, the exact words spoken. But Sarah focused on a different kind of documentation. She tried to understand what the children were experiencing, not just observing their behavior. After several hours, when the trance briefly lifted and the children seemed more present, Sarah approached the youngest girl and asked gently, "Do you know where you are right now?" The girl looked confused for a moment, glancing around the chapel as if seeing it for the first time. "I was somewhere else," she said. "I was on a boat. It was dark and crowded and people were crying. Then I was standing in a line and people were looking at my teeth. Then I was here. Do you remember those things happening to you? They didn't happen to me. They happened before, but I remember them like they happened to me." "How is that possible?" The girl's